The studio lights blazed hot that September evening in 1977, and somewhere between the commercial break and the opening notes of Disaster, Martin Kellerman decided he was going to destroy Ace Frehley's career on national television. Kellerman wasn't just any music journalist. He was the chief classical music critic for the New York Times, a man who'd built his reputation on eviscerating anyone he deemed unworthy of serious musical consideration. And tonight, sitting across from the Space Ace on the Mike Douglas Show, he had orchestrated what he believed would be the most satisfying takedown of his career. What he didn't know was that the quiet guitarist from the Bronx, the one hidden behind silver face paint and a carefully constructed persona of mystery, was about to reveal something that would shatter Kellerman's entire worldview and end his career by morning. Before we dive into what happened that night, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because we're bringing you the untold stories of rock and roll's greatest moments, the ones that never made it into the history books, but changed everything anyway. Martin Kellerman had spent 3 years waging a very public war against Kiss. His reviews weren't just critical. They were personal assassinations dressed in the language of academic musicology. In one particularly vicious piece from 1975, Kellerman had written that Gene Simmons was nothing more than a carnival barker who discovered that teenage boys would pay money to watch someone stick their tongue out. He called Paul Stanley's voice strained and technically limited, suggesting that any competent vocal coach would have relegated him to backup singer status. Peter Criss, according to Kellerman, played drums with all the subtlety of a construction worker operating a jackhammer. But he saved his most venomous assessments for Ace Frehley. Kellerman had written an entire column dedicated to what he called the myth of the Space Ace. He described Ace as nothing more than a prop, a mannequin who'd learned to stand in the right spot while technicians created the actual guitar sounds behind curtains of smoke and flash powder. In a particularly brutal piece published just weeks before the Mike Douglas Show appearance, Kellerman called the Space Ace costume a necessary distraction from Ace's fundamental inadequacy as a musician, suggesting that without the makeup and pyrotechnics, audiences would quickly realize they were watching someone who barely qualified as a competent rhythm player. He wrote that Ace's solos were serviceable at best, cobbled together from blues cliches and pentatonic scales that any first-year guitar student could replicate. These weren't music reviews in any traditional sense. They were character assassinations designed to make Kellerman's readers feel intellectually superior for dismissing Kiss as corporate rock theater devoid of authentic artistry. What made it personal for Kellerman was that Kiss represented everything he believed was destroying American music culture. Here was a band selling millions of albums, filling stadiums across the country, appearing on magazine covers and talk shows, and in Kellerman's estimation, they couldn't play their instruments at a level that would qualify them for admission to a decent music conservatory. The fact that working-class kids and middle America families loved Kiss only proved his point to him. The masses didn't understand real music, and Kiss was the evidence. The producers at the Mike Douglas Show knew exactly what they were doing when they booked both Kiss and Martin Kellerman for the same episode. Mike Douglas himself had built a career on creating television moments that felt spontaneous but were carefully orchestrated for maximum impact. The show was taped in Philadelphia, broadcast nationally every afternoon, and reached an audience that skewed older and more conservative than the typical rock and roll demographic. This promised to be unforgettable television, controversy that would have people talking for weeks. What almost nobody watching that night understood was the trap Kellerman had carefully constructed. He hadn't just accepted the invitation to appear on the show. He'd worked with the producers weeks in advance to engineer a specific moment, a challenge that he believed would publicly humiliate Ace Frehley, and validate every dismissive word Kellerman had written about the band. The challenge was simple and seemingly innocent on the surface, but devastating in its implications. Kellerman would ask Ace to perform a brief acoustic piece, something intimate and stripped down, without the makeup, without the costume, without the stage effects that Kellerman insisted were covering for fundamental musical inadequacy. Just a man and a guitar, demonstrating actual ability. Kellerman had even brought specific sheet music, a composition by Fernando Sor, one of the most technically demanding classical guitar pieces ever written. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Ace would either refuse, confirming he was just a performer rather than a musician, or he would attempt it and fail spectacularly, proving the same point with even greater impact. Either way, Kellerman would win, and his 3-year crusade against Kiss would be vindicated on national television. What Martin Kellerman didn't know, what almost nobody in the music industry knew, was that Paul Daniel Frehley had spent his formative years studying classical guitar under one of the Bronx's most demanding teachers. From age 12 to 17, before the world knew him as Ace, before Kiss existed even as a concept, young Paul Frehley took the train every Tuesday and Thursday evening to a small music studio on Fordham Road. His teacher was Antonio Benedetto, a 70-year-old Italian immigrant who'd performed with some of Europe's finest orchestras before retiring to New York in the late 1950s. Benedetto didn't advertise his teaching services. He didn't take just anyone as a student. You had to be recommended by another musician. You had to demonstrate genuine commitment during an initial evaluation, and you had to withstand his brutal honesty about your playing. Ace's parents, both working multiple jobs to keep their family afloat in a neighborhood where most kids' musical education consisted of whatever they could pick up from the radio or learn from older siblings, had somehow scraped together the money for those lessons, because they saw something in their son that went beyond typical adolescent interests. When Paul picked up a guitar, something changed in him. A focus appeared, a dedication that his teachers had never seen in any of his schoolwork. Benedetto taught classical guitar the old way, the unforgiving European conservatory way. Proper posture, absolutely precise finger positioning, reading standard notation before you were even allowed to play anything that sounded remotely like music. He made Ace practice scales and arpeggios for 6 months before moving on to actual pieces. He assigned compositions by Bach, Sor, Tárrega, Villa-Lobos, and he accepted nothing less than technical perfection. If a note was slightly out of tune, if the timing was fractionally off, if the expression wasn't exactly right, Benedetto would stop Ace mid-measure and make him start over from the beginning. There were no shortcuts, no compromises, no allowances made for the fact that this was a teenage kid from the Bronx who just wanted to play rock and roll. For 5 years, Ace endured this training, showing up every Tuesday and Thursday no matter what else was happening in his life. He developed calluses on his fingertips that never fully went away. He learned to sight-read complex notation, to execute tremolo techniques that required each finger to operate independently while maintaining perfect rhythmic precision, to transition seamlessly between different playing styles within a single piece. He studied music theory, learned to analyze harmonic progressions, understood how classical composers constructed their pieces to create emotional impact. Benedetto pushed him relentlessly, never satisfied, always demanding more precision, more musicality, more understanding of what made a performance transcend mere technical execution. But when Ace joined Kiss in 1973, when Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were building their vision of the ultimate rock and roll spectacle, None of that classical training seemed relevant to the image they were creating. The Space Ace persona was about mystery, about creating a character that existed somewhere between science fiction and hard rock reality. It was about being cool, aloof, enigmatic. Ace never mentioned Antonio Benedetto or those 5 years of disciplined study. It didn't fit the image. The fans wanted to believe that Ace was naturally talented, instinctively gifted, someone who picked up a guitar and just knew how to make it sing. The classical foundation, the hours of structured practice, the academic rigor, all of that stayed hidden beneath the makeup and the mythology. The episode of The Mike Douglas Show began conventionally enough. Mike Douglas, with his characteristic warmth and professional ease, introduced Kiss to an audience that consisted mostly of people who'd never been to a rock concert and probably never would. The band performed 2 songs, scaled-down versions of their arena spectacle but still impressive for afternoon television. Ace's solos were sharp and energetic, exactly what the Kiss Army expected. Gene breathed fire within the safety limitations of a television studio. Paul hit every note with his signature showmanship. Peter's drumming drove the performances with precision. The studio audience, a mix of curious housewives, skeptical older viewers, and a surprising number of teenagers who'd somehow gotten tickets, responded with genuine enthusiasm. But the cameras kept cutting to Martin Kellerman, sitting in the guest section, his expression radiating the kind of intellectual disdain that made you want to either punch him or prove him wrong. He looked like someone forced to sit through a children's birthday party when he'd rather be anywhere else conducting serious business. His expensive suit, his perfectly styled hair, his academic bearing, everything about him screamed that he was above this spectacle, that his presence was an act of charitable criticism. When Mike Douglas brought Kellerman onto the stage after Kiss's performance, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The audience sensed something was wrong, that this wasn't going to be a friendly chat about the band's success or their upcoming tour dates. Douglas, reading from his notes but clearly aware of the tension, asked Kellerman for his professional assessment of what they'd just witnessed. Kellerman didn't hesitate. His response was calculated to wound, phrased in language that sounded objective but dripped with condescension. He talked about the difference between entertainment and musicianship, between commercial success and artistic legitimacy. He suggested that Kiss had mastered marketing while remaining fundamentally limited as actual musicians. He spoke about the importance of musical education, of formal training, of understanding theory and technique. He referenced the great classical guitarists he'd interviewed over the years, the conservatory-trained virtuosos who dedicated their lives to mastering their instrument rather than just learning enough to perform for screaming teenagers. Then, with a smile that wasn't really a smile, Kellerman made his move. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out several pages of sheet music. He walked across the stage, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet studio, and handed them directly to Ace, who was still in full Space Ace makeup, still wearing the silver-studded costume that had become iconic. The sheet music was for Studies for Guitar by Fernando Sor, specifically Etude No. 17 in C major, one of the more technically demanding etudes that required perfect independent finger control and flawless sight-reading ability. The challenge Kellerman issued was devastating in its implications. He asked Ace to perform the piece right there, on acoustic guitar, proving that he could actually play without the electric amplification and stage effects that Kellerman insisted were covering for fundamental inadequacy. The studio went completely quiet. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was an execution, and everyone felt it. Mike Douglas looked uncomfortable, clearly wondering if this had been a good idea after all. Gene Simmons stepped forward like he was going to intervene, his protective instincts toward his bandmate kicking in, but Ace held up a hand, stopping him. The cameras zoomed in on Ace's face, though the silver and black makeup made it impossible to read his expression. 15 million people watching at home wondered what would happen next. Would he refuse and look like he was backing down? Would he get angry and look unprofessional? Would he attempt it and fail, confirming everything Kellerman had written? Ace looked at the sheet music for maybe 10 seconds, his eyes scanning the notation with an intensity that suggested he was actually reading it, not just pretending to understand what he was seeing. Then he looked directly at Kellerman, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, that unmistakable Bronx accent coming through even in this tense moment. "You want me to play this piece? Right now, on this stage?" Kellerman's smile widened, sensing victory. "If you're capable of it, Mr. Frehley. I understand if you'd rather not. There's no shame in admitting that sight-reading classical notation isn't part of your skill set. Most rock guitarists can't do it. It requires years of formal training, dedicated study, the kind of musical education that I suspect you haven't had the opportunity to pursue." The condescension in those words hung in the air like smoke. That's when Ace did something unexpected. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He didn't deflect with humor or try to change the subject. He simply said, "I'll need a classical guitar, not this one." Gesturing to his custom Gibson Les Paul that had been modified for maximum stage impact, but wasn't suited for classical technique. "A nylon string acoustic. You got one of those around here?" Within minutes, a production assistant scrambled backstage and brought out a classical guitar that belonged to one of the show's session musicians. Ace took off the leather gloves that were part of his Space Ace costume, revealing hands that looked surprisingly normal, almost delicate compared to the aggressive rock and roll image. He sat down on a stool that had been brought out, adjusted the guitar's position in his lap with the kind of precise care that suggested this wasn't his first time holding a classical instrument, and checked the tuning by ear with a few quick plucks and careful turns of the tuning pegs. The studio was completely silent now. Even the production crew, who were supposed to remain professional and detached, had stopped what they were doing to watch. This had become something more than just a television show. This was a genuine moment, unrehearsed and unpredictable, the kind of thing that only happens when real stakes are involved. Ace looked at the sheet music one more time, his eyes moving across the notation with a focus that made several musicians in the audience sit up straighter. Then he set the pages down on a music stand that had been positioned next to him, angling it so he could see the notation while playing. He took a breath, his posture shifting into something different, more formal, more studied than the rock and roll stance everyone was used to seeing. And then Ace Frehley began to play Fernando Sor's Etude No. 17 in C major, and the world shifted on its axis. The opening notes filled the studio with a clarity and precision that stopped conversations mid-word, that made hearts beat faster, that created the kind of silence that only appears when something extraordinary is happening. This wasn't approximation. This wasn't someone faking their way through something they'd barely learned. This was the sound of someone who'd spent thousands of hours, countless Tuesday and Thursday evenings, developing the exact techniques required for classical guitar performance. Ace's right hand executed the complex finger-picking patterns with mechanical precision, each finger operating independently, creating multiple melodic lines simultaneously in a way that should have been impossible, but somehow wasn't. His left hand moved up and down the fretboard with confident accuracy, finding each position without hesitation, without the slight delays or corrections that would indicate uncertainty or unfamiliarity. The tremolo technique, where rapid notes create a shimmering, continuous sound, while the thumb maintains a separate bass line, was flawless. Each note was perfectly articulated, perfectly timed, perfectly weighted. But technical precision alone wouldn't have created the reaction that swept through that studio like a physical force. What shocked everyone, what made even Martin Kellerman's carefully maintained expression of superiority crack and then crumble, was the musicality. Ace wasn't just playing the notes correctly. He was interpreting them, giving them emotional weight and dynamic variation. He understood phrasing, the way classical pieces breathed and built and resolved. He understood how to use subtle changes in volume and attack to create tension and release. This wasn't someone who'd learned a party trick to show off. This was someone who genuinely studied classical guitar at a level that most people, including music critics like Kellerman, never achieved. The camera operators had completely abandoned their scripted shots. Every camera was now focused on Ace, trying to capture the impossible thing happening on that afternoon television stage. Some cameras showed his hands, the fingers moving with balletic precision, creating beauty through pure technical mastery. Others showed his face, the Space Ace makeup creating a surreal contrast with the refined classical performance unfolding beneath it. One camera found Martin Kellerman in the audience, and what it captured became one of television's most memorable moments of complete and utter defeat. Kellerman's face went through a transformation that was almost painful to watch. The smug certainty drained away first, replaced by confusion, as if he couldn't reconcile what his ears were hearing with what his eyes were seeing. Then came something that looked like genuine distress, the realization that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation, that his entire understanding of Ace Frehley, and by extension his judgment of Kiss, had been built on assumptions rather than facts. Ace continued through Soar's etude, building toward the piece's most challenging sections. There's a passage about 2/3 through where the guitarist must maintain a complex melodic line while simultaneously executing a series of rapid position changes that require the left hand to jump up and down the neck in ways that make even conservatory students nervous. Ace played through it without hesitation, every note clear and perfectly timed. His technique showed the kind of refinement that only comes from serious formal training under a demanding teacher, the kind that Kellerman had spent 3 years insisting Ace didn't possess. As the piece approached its conclusion, something shifted in Ace's posture, in the way he leaned into certain phrases. This wasn't just about proving a critic wrong anymore. This was personal in a way that went deeper than professional vindication. This was for Antonio Benedetto, who'd spent 5 years teaching a working-class kid from the Bronx that music could be more than just entertainment, that it could be art, that discipline and technique weren't limitations, but rather the foundation of true creative freedom. This was for Ace's parents, who'd sacrificed to pay for those lessons when they could barely afford rent. This was for every musician who'd been dismissed as just a commercial act. When Ace played the final notes of the Soar etude, allowing them to ring out and decay naturally in the studio's acoustics, there was absolute silence for approximately 5 seconds. Then the studio exploded with applause. The audience was on their feet, screaming. Other musicians waiting backstage rushed out to see what was happening. Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, and Peter Criss were applauding and shouting. Mike Douglas stood there looking genuinely shocked. Even the production crew was applauding. The cameras found Martin Kellerman. He wasn't applauding. He was sitting perfectly still, staring at Ace, his face pale, When Mike Douglas walked over and asked for his assessment, Kellerman stood up slowly. He walked across the stage to where Ace was sitting. The audience went quiet again. What happened next became legendary. "Mr. Frehley," Kellerman said, his voice shaking, "I came here tonight absolutely certain of my understanding of musical excellence. I was completely, fundamentally wrong. You are not just a competent guitarist. You're an exceptional one. Classical training, rock and roll instinct, technical precision, emotional depth. You possess all of it. I've spent 3 years dismissing you, and I was projecting my own prejudices." Ace stood up and faced him. "You don't have to do this," Ace said quietly. "Yes, I do," Kellerman replied. "Because I didn't just criticize your music. I attacked your legitimacy without learning anything about you. That's not criticism. That's prejudice." He extended his hand. Ace shook it. By morning, every newspaper was covering the story. Kellerman resigned from the New York Times before being fired. His resignation letter became legendary. "I have spent 15 years claiming to guard musical excellence. In reality, I was guarding only my own narrow definitions. Last night, Ace Frehley taught me that genius doesn't respect arbitrary boundaries. I am not qualified to judge music anymore." Antonio Benedetto, 82 and still teaching in the Bronx, told reporters, "Paul was my most disciplined student. He understood that technique was about possibility. That's real musicianship." On that night in 1977, the Space Ace proved you could reach for the stars while staying grounded in classical fundamentals. Ace Frehley showed that the most powerful response to prejudice is demonstrating excellence so undeniable that even your harshest critics must acknowledge it.